Sup bitches? I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff. So here I am, pimping my stuff in what's hopefully an amusing way. If you want to interact with me and follow me, you can find me on Twitter at Grimasaur and at Mort_post for official announcements. The Great Replacement is an idea that certain right-wing people of a more conspiratorial bent have, that we are being deliberately replaced, done away with by non-white European people. And this extends to the US, extends to many countries in Europe. A while ago now, I did 2 videos on the Kalergi plan, which is one sort of prong of the idea that this is going on. This is supposedly contained within a book called Praktischer Idealismus, but there is no plan in that book. It is simply Count Coudenhove Kalergi, who suitably sounds like a supervillain and who was half German and half Japanese, setting out what he saw as trends moving forward into the future and his ideals for a way in which the world might develop. He wanted to see a pan-European state, as many people did in the aftermath of World War I and later World War II. But there is no plan there. Nothing is spelled out. There is no meat on the bones of this conspiracy theory. So why am I going to talk about this Great Replacement? Well, this is the aspect that people tend to bring up the most. And in the commentary on those videos, I tend to get a lot of absurdly right-wing people who, when they're not berating me for my appearance or just swearing, act like this whole Great Replacement thing is just obvious. Like, oh, how can you say it's not happening? Look outside. Look at the immigration. You know, look at what's happening in our cities. So I go and look, and it's just crickets. There is nothing happening. Nothing that they say really seems to be true. No skyrocketing crime rates. No significant impact on wages. Nothing that they say seems to really hold water when you look at it. So that particular aspect seems to me to be worth a more fulsome debunking, because it is bollocks. This whole idea is nothing new. The Great Replacement, or its equivalents, used to be the paranoid cry about the Chinese at one point. Part of the idea of the yellow peril was that demographics were destiny, and that the sheer fact that there were so many Chinese meant that they would somehow overrun the West. There's quite a line in rather racist Victorian and Edwardian fiction based around that. There's also been the idea in a lot of countries that this would be a problem not because of brown people or yellow people or black people, but rather because of Catholicism. A lot of anti-Irish and anti-Italian sentiment, particularly in the United States, was centered around the idea that these people would bring their damned papism into the country and that they would outbreed the locals. Well, are we all hip deep in Catholics? Not so much. It's still a religious minority in the States, still a religious minority in the UK. The spectre of fecund Catholicism never really emerged, for many of the same reasons that this spectre of fecund Islam is not going to emerge. It's not a new idea. It's not a new panic button to hit. It still seems to affect people, but I think most people are not aware of the history of this or the statistics. And I'm well aware that a rational argument is not going to reach a lot of these people, but you gotta try. But look at the immigration. We're letting in unprecedented numbers of people into the country. This has got to have some. It's depressing wages. They're using up resources. Blah blah blah. We all know the arguments. Okay, well let's look at immigration then. Net migration in 2019 to the UK was about 227,000 people. That's a third of 1% of the UK population. The highest it's ever been was 331,000 in 2015, and that's still less than 0.5% of the total UK population. And a lot of those people do go home later on. Many thousands return home. Those figures that we have are only really for the enforced or forced repatriations, but a lot of people return anyway. A lot of those number are students who end up going home with their newly acquired qualifications to do things at home. And plenty of other people just go home. Things don't work out here, or they never intended to stay for a long time. Of that number, the 227,000, non-EU is only 175,000 of that. And even then, some percentage of that is going to be white from white countries outside of the EU and from the US. But a peculiarity of this is that they claim to be worried about white Western civilization and yet don't count a lot of white Western people as being a white Western when it's convenient. Particularly Eastern Europeans and people of Slavic origin seem to have this sort of nebulous quantum state where they're a good thing on the one hand and a bad thing on the other. This makes it difficult to argue with people because it's like trying to nail pudding to a wall. Now, ironically, of course, if you are concerned about brown people and Islam, then the comparative rate of immigration from outside the EU is now a much higher proportion and is likely to increase even further because we still need immigration, but we've cut off our nose to spite our face by leaving the EU. If you wanted to keep non-EU migration low, you probably should have voted to stay in the European Union, but there you go. The worry then cannot be the raw numbers, because it's essentially meaningless in the overall scheme of things. What about this idea that they're going to outbreed us? On the face of it, this looks like it has some kind of legs to it, because the UK fertility rate, native-born UK fertility rate, is around 1.7 births per woman, right? Whereas immigrant fertility rates are something over 2 per woman. So that's an extra third of a child per person. So even at that rate, right, we would expect it to take a very, very long time for any particular ethnic group of immigrants to outbreed the native population. And that's without considering that they become native population, or that there are other white Western immigrants who settle here and who also have babies, and Catholics. So that should from Poland and so on. So that should keep us caught up, right? Shouldn't it? But they're missing something in that the reason immigrant birth rates are so high is because of the culture and the context and the situation in the countries that they're coming from, where medical care is often less, where welfare is often less, where your retirement plan is to have surviving children to take care of you in your dotage. But as you move down the generations from that initial immigrant family, the birth rates normalise step by step by step until they're the same as local births. For example, the most recent wave of immigration to the UK has dropped its fertility rate from somewhere over 2 per woman to under 2 per woman, about 1.95. And it continues to drop. Studies internationally, whichever country you care to mention, generation by generation, birth rates normalise. Culture normalises. People integrate. Even if their initial immigrant families want to segregate themselves, you can't help but integrate over time. Most of the people that come to the country come to study, which is time limited. They're going to be here a couple of years, maybe 5 years at the outside if they stay all the way through, and they go home. The next larger section are people who come here for work, and they're contributing to our society. So why are you upset about them? Particularly since they're filling positions that need to be filled. We're in the middle of a pandemic. You can see, looking at the statistics, that we have become perilously short of doctors and nurses, and that's just from EU migration dropping off. we're going to have to make up the numbers somewhere. Then there's the crop picking and everything else, which has also become problematic, which is going to require more immigration to make up the numbers. Okay, so does that have a massive kind of impact on the resources that we have? Do they act as a drain on the exchequer? Well, no. EU migrants to the UK, and this is another case of us cutting off our nose to spite our face, they pay in about 1.3 times what they take out, while non-EU migrants pay in about 1.1 times what they take out. And that's just in terms of taxation and benefits directly. It doesn't include the overall value of the work that they do. It's just them as individuals. You know, they're working for a boss, and their boss makes money, which, provided they don't evade their taxation, also goes into the exchequer. They're spending money while they're here, which contributes to the economy. But this is just concerned with direct taxation from that individual person. But again, we're going to lose the EU ones who pay in a lot more, and we're going to have a lot more non-EU migrants who, while they do pay in more than they take out, it's going to be lesser. So that's going to have a negative, depressing effect on the economy altogether, but ironically enabled at the hands of people who are anti-immigration. The effect on wages? Well, studies and estimates say that about a 1% population immigration inflow, that's in a year, leads to somewhere between a 0.2 to 0.6 loss of wages, mostly concentrated amongst the lowest earners. Now, the more recent studies tend to show the lesser and lesser amount. It's there, but it's not very much. So we have to admit that there is a very small depressive effect on wages. But they're also supplying workers for jobs that locals won't do, don't want to do, find hard or difficult or demeaning, and that we have a hard time filling the positions for. So it's not really like they're stealing jobs from locals for the most part. Now, I'm not just talking about fruit picking and so on. In hospitals, again, we have this shortage of doctors and nurses, and we fill those gaps where we can't train enough people in enough time by hiring people from abroad. And now we can't so much, not so easily. We are experiencing problems, not because of immigration, but because of a lack of immigration. That's the real problem here. We're not bringing in enough of the people that we need because it's unpopular, but it's unpopular amongst people who haven't really looked into this at all. This is particularly thrown into sharp relief when we consider that 0.2%, which is the most accurate and up-to-date estimate, loss of wages amongst the lowest paid, pales into insignificance next to the gap, the increasing gap between how our productivity has increased and how our wage growth hasn't. If things had continued on the same trend, we would be a lot wealthier, all of us, because if wages had kept match with productivity, well, the gap between the two now is about 42%, meaning that a full-time minimum wage worker in the UK should be earning about 23k a year rather than 16k if wages had kept up with productivity increases. Compare that amount to that 0.2% depressive effect on wages. So in perspective, the problem is not that relatively minuscule effect of immigration, but the screwing over of workers by a more laissez-faire, neoliberal and unregulated capitalism. Immigrants and low-paid workers should have solidarity with each other against this exploitation, instead of fighting each other over scraps, over 0.2% rather than 42%. So if it's not some scheme or plot by a half-German, half-Japanese count or the Jews, then why is all this immigration going on? And it is more than there has been in the past. And why do we have the economic problems that we do, and why are the immigrants being blamed for it if it's not actually them that's responsible? Why has crime gone up to the tiny extent that it has compared to the precipitous drop since the 1990s? Well, economic and demographic issues. The 2008 Great Recession, and doubtless the depression that is coming thanks to COVID, did not hit people evenly. Much like William Gibson's Future, the impact of the economic downturns has not been evenly distributed, and it has affected poorer people more, and they have not experienced the recovery that the middle class and the owner class and the rent-seeking class have. So for them, it seems like the problems have continued because we haven't spread out the benefits, and we haven't spread out the benefits of immigration either. And so long as we refuse to deal with those underlying problems, we leave the field open for other people to come in with fake ideas about what's wrong, what the problem is, to whisper in the ears of particularly the underclass and the working class. Hence Brexit, hence Trump. The left, or the shambling corpse that used to be the left, has abdicated the argument and has instead fixated upon the identity politics fixations of a certain kind of up-themselves middle class, abandoning the working class, while the right and the hard right and the far right have been courting that working class. So, you've been unemployed since 2008. It's those immigrants. You can't see a doctor. It's those immigrants. But it's not. The problems are, like, for housing, there is not enough investment in social housing for anybody, let alone immigrants. And asylum seekers are extremely vulnerable, so they tend to go to the top of the list. Understandably so, because we try to be humanitarian. And you can argue that charity should begin at home, certainly, but let's open it up for everybody. Social investment is not there. We've not dealt with the underlying economic problems. We've not provided retraining. We've tightened the social safety nets to the point where they're almost unlivable. None of this is immigrants' fault. In fact, they have blunted the impact of all of this stuff. But we don't make the argument. We don't reach out. We don't talk to people. We don't explain these things. We don't point them to the statistics. We don't treat them like intelligent human beings who can make up their own mind when presented with the facts. We treat them like idiots and racists because of the capture of the shambling corpse of the left by identity politics. And so we get Brexit, we get Trump, we get hatred towards immigrants. And there's a warning from history too. What makes the West in its current incarnation so successful, so powerful, such a great place to be, is the very multiculturalism that you decry, is the openness of our societies, is the plurality of our societies. Certainly historically this seems to be the case. We can look to ancient Rome. It used to be a multicultural society. You could worship whatever god you wanted. There were many different races, many different ideas, many different creeds, and it was just seen as different, not something necessarily to be decried. The Christians upended that, and it's pretty much as Rome became a monoculture that it lost its power and collapsed. The Islamic Golden Age is another wonderful example. At the time, the Islamic states were these wonderful, comparatively speaking, open societies that were open to all manner of ideas and investigations, science, art, different religions, different people. All right, you had to live under the thumb of Islam, but even so, they were, broadly speaking, multicultural societies. And people within that society were free to question and explore mathematics, art, optics, science. And then that all changed when a much more hardline version of the faith began to take control, when mathematics or seeking to understand the universe became seen almost as an insult to Allah. And that's when the Islamic Golden Age collapsed. If we make the same mistake, if we turn insular, if we demand that we become a monoculture, then likely we're going to experience the same problem. And ironically, a lot of what is driving that, this sort of anti-multiculturalism, anti the exchange of ideas and thoughts and patterns, is coming as much from the shambling corpse of the left as it is from the right. And that places everything, ironically, that the right seems to think is praiseworthy at risk, because they're damning the very things that make those strengths express themselves. That culture isn't racial, it's software, not hardware. It doesn't matter, it wouldn't matter if white people died out, so long as the positive parts of the cultural apparatus that we have constructed, the cultural technology that we have constructed, science, reason, evidence, liberalism, democracy, humanitarianism, so long as those ideas persisted, it wouldn't matter. Race is irrelevant. It's memes, not genes. Zang. "Rrrr," said the grinder as it chewed its way through Alice, from the crown of her head all the way down to her toes. It ate the lot of her, unfussy, snout to tail, and cleared its plate. It gnashed its way through her dress, her pinafore, her shoes, and her unmentionables. It chewed her hair, devoured her scalp, gobbled up her arms, wolfed down her legs, gorged itself on her torso, noshed on her skin, and gulped her down without so much as a burp to show for it.